Welcome back. Today we are going to be looking at the easily accessible Lance Cavalry units, mainly the 3 and 4 star ones in the normal pool, as well as the ones you could get from the Grail shop, including the recently added Geralt, who is a really cool Lance Cav that I'm surprised didn't get messed up, but I'll cover him when we get there. A lot of the Lance Cavs that are easily accessible were definitely littered early on into the lifespan of Fae, but as time went on and more books came around, we started getting a bit less and less, but we still have quite a lot of Lance Cavalry units readily available to us. So we're going to be here for quite a while, so I hope you enjoy the ride. Nevertheless, we're basically going to be doing the same thing as before. We're going to be taking a good look at each and every one of these readily available Lance Cavalry units, giving an analysis and a rating, 2 ratings in fact. For those who have been here before, you already know what the deal is, but for the people who are seeing this for the first time, let me go over the rating system real quick. I have 2 types of ratings. I have the performance rating and the cost rating. The performance rating is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta. Whether or not they need to replace their PF with something else, whatever the case may be. If they have something that allows them to compete, they'll get a higher performance rating. But there are also a bunch of factors that will also hold them back, like stats and yada yada yada. It really just depends. But then we have the cost rating, which is basically how easy it is to invest into the unit on a minimalistic level. So if you just want to use them on budget and see how they perform, that's basically what the cost rating is going to be. However, if you're looking to max invest into these units, and the cost rating doesn't really have much application in this video or in general, it's just mainly for those who want to go in and try them out with as minimal investment as possible. And these are basically the ratings I'm going to be using for each and every one of these units. Simple enough, right? There's really not much else I could really say on these. You got the performance rating, you got the cost rating. I'm going to be going over an analysis for each and every one of these readily available Lance Cavalry units, and we may as well just get started right now with our first unit, Abel. Abel was a launch cavalry unit that got a really early refine. It's basically attack defense 4, but it only peaks at +6 stats, which isn't bad by any means. But the refine effect grants him player phase brave if he's within 2 spaces of a sword, lance, or axe cavalry unit, which is really strict, considering that even though he has 3 movement, which is really good just for getting in combat, it will require specific positioning for you to even use this player phase weapon, which is a bit unfortunate because I do think if it also had applications in the enemy phase, it would be a lot better. But we do have a weapon similar to that, but we'll go over that way later on when we get to them. But nevertheless, for what it's worth, it's not like the worst weapon. If you were to use them with Wings of Mercy and then fly into a cavalry unit that has less than 50% HP, and they also use a sword, lance, or axe, then you could still get the player phase brave going, but I don't think it's really that reliable as a weapon overall. In terms of its overall stats, they aren't the worst by any means, especially if you were to max invest, but you can definitely tell that it hasn't aged considerably well, especially compared to modern units who may not even have a PRF, but just have the Satling ready to go out of the gate, so they take way less investment, and are due for a refine in the future, because Abel is pretty much just done as is. He already got his refine, nothing else going for him. He has 33, 32 attack speed, which isn't the worst. Again, you could give him a bunch of flowers and merges, and it'll basically catch him up to modern BST cavalries, but it's still definitely on the lower end comparatively. And his defensive stats aren't exactly the best, so if you want him to take a hit, it's not really going to be all that efficient, especially since 39 HP with 25 defense res, he's probably prone to a lot of one-shots, but nevertheless, it's not the worst stat line by any means. If you want to use them on budget, I highly recommend just stacking up as much attack and speed as possible, and then using Wings of Mercy. He basically would be acting in the form of a Wings of Mercy beacon support, as getting the Brave effect otherwise is going to be really difficult. However, as previously mentioned, you will need specific allies for this to work anyway, so your team is really limited in scope. You can actually use this with the recently released Brave Selef, who has his miracle effect, so setting up the Wings of Mercy is going to be really easy. And if you were to chain it with double Mystic Boost, and he could always have his player phase going, and then Abel could always just swoop in and have the Brave attack going, which isn't the worst by any means, but again, it's very specific. However, if you want to max invest into him, I highly recommend just ditching his weapon entirely, and then giving him something that can allow him to adequately secure doubles in the player phase, such as Springy Lance, as it not only gives him an attack speed boost, but also neutralizes any penalties to his overall attack and speed, meaning that he'll more than likely be able to secure his own doubles. You could give him Speed Smoke 4 so that he could get damage reduction after setting up on the first combat, and then catch for just a bunch of attack and speed, and whatever flow you want just so he can secure his own double in the player phase. You probably don't want to give him Flow Force because it also has overlap with Springy Lance, which is why I chose Flow Guard, but if you have Flow Refresh, that also works just as well. Overall though, he's still rather generic despite having a PRF to call his own. It's not really the best PRF, and even if you were to keep it, he's going to lock behind a lot of modern Lance Cavalry units who may not even have a PRF simply because they just have way better stat allocation, which is why I think a 5.5 out of 10 is fair for him, at the very least. Next we have Berkut, who actually got a decent refine, but the problem mainly stems from the fact that he's an enemy phase cav, and it's still sad to see that even to this day we don't really have a lot of coveted enemy phase cavalry skills. They really just have to rely on quick riposte, which is more of the problem with Berkut rather than the refine itself. But nevertheless, it basically grants +8 attack defense res if both conditions are fulfilled, and it has lull attack defense built into it. So it's not a bad weapon by any means, especially since modern weapons also tend to get like +8 to everything. Having +8 attack defense res from the weapon isn't bad at all. He has 34 attack, which is pretty solid, 22 speed, which is going to be his dump stat, 31 defense, which isn't the worst by any means, and 24 res, which is a bit low, but if you were to just use him as a melee specialist, then it's not really going to be the biggest issue unless you go up against dragons. But more often than not, melee foes tend to target defense, so it's not really the worst by any means. If you want to use him on budget, he's actually relatively cheap to build. All he really needs is an attack defense form, quick riposte, and an attack smoke. All of it's really readily available in the 3 and 4 star pool, minus quick riposte, which you have to promote to 5 star, but even then, still readily available as is. And his premium build isn't really going to be much of an upgrade outside of just giving him the guard effect in the enemy phase and then joint drive attack for just extra damage output. But as you can see, for the most part, it's pretty much the same build, just with a bit of an upgrade more or less. And that's pretty much what he'll basically need to function. He still requires a lot of investment just so he can bolster up his stats overall, but he's still going to be hitting quite hard, especially since he has the lull attack defense effect in his weapon, so that's really nice to have. However, as previously mentioned, he is an enemy phase cav, and that's more of a problem with just the bitter treatment that IS gives these units rather than the unit himself, because if you were to put this weapon on like an armor, for example, this would still be a really good weapon, but until we get an enemy phase cavalry skill that allows him to just consistently double. Maybe if we were to get something like akin to Dragon's Ire, which isn't exactly the best one either, but it's a lot better than Quick Riposte, especially since it's a 50% threshold and it bypasses impact effects. We just need something more competitive for enemy phase cavalry, which is why I'm not confident in giving him a higher score than Abel. I still think 5 out of 10 is fine, but until we get something for enemy phase cavs, I can't really see these types of units really going that high. Unless they have speed, of course, in which case they can function relatively in both phases, but those are few and far between. But speaking of which, we have Camus, who has a distant counter Spectrum 4 weapon that has Bell Ringer built into it, so every time he attacks, he gets 7 HP back to himself. His silent's pretty alright for the most part. He has 32 attack, 33 speed, not bad, 31 defense, which is pretty decent, and 17 res is definitely his dump stat. So despite having a distant counter weapon, you will still have to watch out for mages because there's still a good chance that he can get 1-shot or 2-shot depending on how many attacks he has to take in the enemy phase. And the thing is that you can tell this is absolutely built for the enemy phase because the condition is based on whether or not either the foe initiates combat or if the foe's HP is 100%. And relying on the foe to always have 100% HP isn't really reliable, so you're more than likely always just going to be using them in the enemy phase. But nevertheless, it can still function in the player phase in some scenarios. If you want to use him on budget, you can pretty much just give him double solo, stack up his attack and speed, and potentially res if you just want him to at least take a hit every now and then. He does heal back quite a bit from his weapon, assuming he doubles, so he can actually have quite a good amount of survivability. Defense smoke is also there just so he can secure kills, and attack speed link is just there for visible buffs, which you could pretty much apply with tactics or whatever the case may be. But in terms of just budget B slots, there really aren't that many, especially for enemy phase cavs, or even player phase cavs for that matter. We don't really have that many budget options, but nevertheless, it still works. However, if you want to use him on premium, you can pretty much just stack up attack and speed as much as possible, and then give him speed smoke 4 so that even if he has to take hits in the enemy phase, he can still reduce the amount of incoming damage, meaning that his survivability is actually not going to be that bad whatsoever because he gets damage reduction from it. And I know I ragged on Berkut earlier because he's an enemy phase cav, but I think for Camus it's a bit different because even though they do function fairly similarly, Camus does have the healing and he is fast enough to warrant speed smoke 4. So he could still reduce the amount of incoming damage he's taking as opposed to Berkut, who is going to have to rely on either attack smoke 4, which he could still run, but that could still be shut down by guaranteed follow-ups or anything with no follow-up, or just taking it head-on, which is going to be a problem regardless. Even then, I still think despite the enemy phase Cav's status, Camus does function a lot better just because he has the speed set, which is why I do think a 6 out of 10 is warranted. Next we have Cleve, who's an okay unit for the most part. He has armor effectiveness, and he has the Joint Drive Spectrum 3 effect, which is equivalent to the likes of Yato, except it grants 1 less, but nevertheless, it's basically the same thing as Yato. It's pretty supportive, but it could also work on himself. In terms of his overall stat line, it is quite mediocre. He has a lot of HP, which he can still use for supportive capabilities, which isn't the worst by any means. 33 attack is okay, 25 speed, you can, I guess, do something with it, but I really wouldn't count on it too much unless you're like hyper stacking it. 32 defense is okay, and 19 res is his obvious dump stat. It's not really the best stat allocation, and given that he does have a proximity effect, more often than not, you're probably just going to be using him in the enemy phase. However, because it is supportive in nature, you can actually just make him a support unit. You could give him HP skills with Panic Ploy, Drive Attack, a Link, anything that can support an ally is probably the best thing you could do with him. And for that reason, I also made that his premium set too. I upgraded his A slot to be dual Cavalry 4, so he's getting more stats in total. That way, at the very least, he can at least take hits and perform in the enemy phase to an okay extent if you really need him to. I give him even pulse tie, so again, supportive in nature. Joint drive attack, so he could also benefit from it, and an HP attack too, so he can secure even pulse tie triggers. But in terms of support, he's really not the best in general. We also have Allied Lance, which doesn't provide speed and res, but it's not really too far off from the amount of stats you just get from it. On top of the fact that you could just put this on any supportive unit and potentially get even more supportive capabilities, because cavalry units are locked out of specific support skills, so it isn't actually the worst idea in general. But again, for what it's worth, it's still an okay support weapon, which is why I do think a 5 out of 10 is fine for him. Next we have Conrad, who's basically equivalent to the likes of Berkut. He has a lot more res, but he doesn't have as much attack or HP, and he's definitely a lot more min-maxed. He comes with Barrier Lance, and that's just 7 res in the enemy phase, which, okay, not too bad. If you want to use him on budget, I highly recommend just getting rid of Barrier Lance and giving him Stout Lance from a Roshea, or Courtly Candle from an Eldigan, although Stout Lance is definitely going to be a lot cheaper. This way he can at least tank a lot more. You can keep his innate bracing stance, and then give him quick riposte and attack smoke with defense res form, so he's just basically acting as a min-max tank. It's not exactly the best because he's on a cav, but nevertheless, it still works for what he's trying to accomplish. And then for the premium set, you can upgrade his bracing stance to distant stance. You can still keep Stout Lance, but you could also give him attack smoke 4. So that way he's just taking less damage in general. And for the most part, his mixed bulk is really, really good. It's just that because he is a cavalry, he also has to look out for specific weaknesses. He doesn't have access to a lot of good enemy phase skills. And as such, he still also suffers the same as Berkut, which is why I also gave him the same rating. Berkut does have a decent PRF for what it's worth, but you also got to remember that Flowing Lance also exists, which is basically the equivalent. It doesn't grant as much stats. I think it's only like 3 off, but nevertheless, Conrad is definitely a lot more min-max in what he's trying to accomplish, which is why I do think it's fair to say that they're pretty equivalent in terms of just enemy phase prowess. Next we have Death Knight, who has a really cool weapon that I wish was a lot more consistent. It's a slaying weapon that prevents any sort of follow-up from the foe and grants Spectrum 4 if they have a visible bonus on them. So if they have a rally, extra movement, whatever the case, but it's really, really inconsistent both for the player and the enemy because of the fact that you can just work around it whenever you see him, but also the fact that there's just so many no follow-up effects in the game to where it's not really going to be as effective as it could have probably been when it came out. But nevertheless, it's not the worst weapon. I just find that you can do a lot better with it. In terms of his stat line, he actually has a pretty decent stat line. He has 35 attack, which is pretty good, 30 defense, 27 res, which isn't the worst for mixed bulk, 25 speed, which is definitely his dump stat, but you can stack it. But again, that's also going to take hyper stacking, good amount of support, yada yada yada, you name it. And 40 HP, which isn't bad. In terms of his overall stat line, it's not that bad. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well just stack up attack and defense as much as possible and then make him into a melee specialist. He does have sling, so he can consistently trigger 3 cooldown specials, even if he doesn't get doubled, because 3 cooldown specials get turned into 2 cooldown specials. And then with a bunch of attack and defense in tow, he'll be able to tank quite a bit, which is really nice. And then if you want to make him work on premium, you could just take distance stance, quick riposte, so he can reliably double and attack from afar, which is pretty good. Pulse smoke, so you can pretty much prevent any sort of special from the foe unless it's pre-charged. But nevertheless, if they do charge it from your attacks and they try to attack again, then Pulse Smoke will just prolong your longevity in general, which is really nice. And then Defense Res Solo, so he just gets more mixed bulk. Overall though, he still suffers from the same effects as Berkut, Conrad, most of the enemy phase Cavs who don't really have a speed stat, which is why I'm also going to give him a 5 out of 10. I'm hopeful that his refine, which should be sooner rather than later, I think he's a bit after Chronia, and I think Chronia's in December, so we'll have to wait and see. I hope it will at least make him a lot better, because I do think he has potential. Next we have Ferdinand, who has Vanguard, which is basically the defense variant of Barrier Lance, grants 7 defense in the enemy phase, which isn't the worst, but again, he's pretty generic, but he does have a pretty decent stat line. He has 32 attack, which isn't the highest, but still decent, and 35 speed, which is pretty good, 30 defense, which isn't bad whatsoever, and then 24 res, which is going to be his dump stat. But for the most part, for a demo, it's not a bad stat line. If you want to just use him on budget, you can pretty much stack up all his stats as much as possible. You could give him Rouse Speed Defense for his C slot, and then you could give him Attack Res Link for his B slot. So that way you could pretty much just make him a big stat ball. You could keep Vanguard if you want, just so he gets more stats in general, and is tanking a lot more. And then a catch with Solo, so he's just becoming a big stat ball. That's basically the goal with the budget set. How effective it may be, hard to say, but for what it's worth, it should work. However, if you want something a lot more effective and more premium, you can basically make him a Gale Force unit with its curtains, stack up attack and speed as much as possible, and then give him a near trace so that way after he enters his second combat, he can run away with a good amount of movement, provided that he doesn't overextend again. And it's not bad. He is going to be due for a refine sooner or later because I think he is book 4. So if you are looking for an okay March project and you do want to build Fernand, he's not the worst option. Granted, there are better options, but in terms of just overall prowess, I would still say he's like equivalent to the likes of Abel. I would still say he's a bit better just because he has a way better allocated stat line. But nevertheless, they're going to be performing quite similar for the most part. Next, we have Fernand, who is basically our Gen 5 Berkut. He has a lot of attack and a decent amount of defense. He also has a lot of HP at 45 base, but then his speed and res are pretty much going to be his dump. Again, you can still stack speed if you really want to, but I don't want to really keep rehashing this point because you guys get it at this point. But nevertheless, he comes with Instant Lance, which basically is an impact effect, which is pretty good. However, if the foe has any sort of guaranteed follow-up with good amount of speed, or they have no follow-up, it's not really going to work, which is why I highly recommend just ditching it in general. For budget purposes, you can pretty much just give him Brave Lance because he does have a lot of base attack. 41 base is really high, so even with an 8 might weapon, it's still going to hit quite hard, especially with double Death Blow and Defense Smoke. It should do quite well. I also gave him Lance Breaker because chances are if he's going up against a sword unit, he's more than likely going to take them out in 2 hits anyway, as he does have a lot of attack. So having Lance Breaker just for more color coverage isn't the worst on budget. And for his premium set, you can still keep Brave Lance, but what you can do instead is stack up his attack and defense as much as possible, give him Sturdy Surge so he can heal, Rouse Attack Defense 4 so he's just getting a bunch of bonuses, and Null Panic, and then Heavy Blade so he can secure 2 cooldown specials quite consistently. It definitely beats using him in the enemy phase because you're basically just rehashing Berkut, but nevertheless, I still find that they're, again, quite similar because of how their stat allocations are, and Fernand doesn't really have a dedicated PRF as is, so for what it's worth, if you had to choose between the two, you really couldn't go wrong with either per se, but Fernand does have a lot of attack, which can actually allow him to function a bit more in the player phase if you give him the right weapon. Next, we have Finn, who is a really good Lance Cavalry unit, especially for an accessible one. He has a dual phase Brave weapon that grants him additional speed but cuts down on his overall bulk, and then if his HP is above 25% or more, he inflicts -4 attack speed defense on the foe during combat and has a low attack defense effect during combat, which means you can't really buff your defense against him, so he's more likely to output a good amount of damage, which is still really nice. In terms of his offensive stat line, he has 34-33 attack, which is pretty good. His defensive stats aren't exactly the best, even though his weapon also inflicts -4 attack. He's still getting a penalty from his base, which isn't really that great, especially if you're looking to take a hit with him. I don't really think he's going to be able to do that all too well, so you're more than likely going to be relying on 2 tapping, which you can still potentially do with the right skill set, but if he does have to take a hit, there's a good chance that he's more than likely going to either fall below 25% HP, meaning that he loses out on another condition, or he's just going to get one shot. But nevertheless, you could potentially try to set him up for the Desperation range. It will take a bit of setup because, again, his bulk isn't exactly the highest, so you will have to set up on a specific unit. Otherwise, he'll still fall below 25% HP. The idea is just mainly you keep between the 25% HP and 75% HP threshold, so you can still get get 4 attacks out without having to take damage. As such, you can pretty much just run Blade Sessions with Sparrow and Defense Smoke, so you can pretty much just secure damage output. And then for his premium build, you can stack up attack and speed with Catch, Trace, Solo, and you could also give him Speed Smoke 4 if he needs to take a hit in the enemy phase, so he's reducing the amount of damage taken in general, which is a good idea, especially if you want to make him more mixed phase. But even then, despite his shaky bulk, I find that he's probably one of the best Lance Cavalry investments that you can make. The base effect already is still one of the strongest effects you can have for any unit, because being able to double regardless of speed is really, really good. But combine that with his speed set means that he could also potentially bypass some of the faster units who stack speed and rely on damage reduction. So he's able to take out quite a bit of units, which is why I do think an 8 out of 10 is quite warranted. Next we have Jagan, who has an attack res bonus lance that has sabotage attack built into it. His stat line outside of his res is really bad. He has 27 attack, which is really bad, 37 HP, which is pretty low, 24 defense speed, which isn't really good either. So you're really just going to make him supportive in nature. I wouldn't really use him as a combat unit because he really won't be able to function as anything else but support. If you want to use him on budget, we do have a good amount of sabotages readily available, which is really nice. You can keep his innate fury, give him sabotage res, and defense ploy. Defense ploy is a bit of a meme, but if you're just looking to debuff, it's not really the worst thing you can do. And then you could just continue to stack up his res by using Fortress Res, which works out pretty well. But if you want to use them on premium, you're basically going to be doing the same thing as you were on budget, but you're basically just going to be stacking as much res as possible so you can get his res checks going. You could also go with defense bonuses so we can at least take a hit from a melee foe, and upgrade his sabotage res to sabotage speed or sabotage defense, whichever preference you have. Crossbow attack so he can also act more supportive, and a rally plus just for more stats. And akin to Cleve, I find that his support is still good. It's definitely a bit better because sabotages are really nice to have, but I don't find he's much better comparatively. But even so, for a support unit, it's not exactly the worst. It's just that we also have stuff like Tamari, which is attack speed, but then they could also use the B slot, so they have a lot more variety there. But for what it's worth, it's not bad for support. Next we have Geralt, who is absurdly strong for a free unit. I know we just got into Gen 7, and he is the freebie, but I didn't expect his weapon to be like this good, especially for a free unit. And to be fair, it's pretty much akin to Dusel, but even then, it's still a really good weapon on a free-to-play unit. It's a 19 might weapon that inflicts -6 attack defense and panic on a specific foe with the highest attack defense total, and foes within 2 spaces of that foe. So it's basically a chilling seal for panic and attack defense debuff, which is really nice. It's also unconditional, so no matter what his HP is at, or no matter what his stats are, it's always going to go off. And then for his combat effect, if he has more than 25% of his HP present, he inflicts another -6 attack and defense on the foe during combat and makes a guaranteed follow-up. So again, pretty akin to the likes of Dusel, but he has a lot more capabilities going for him. His stat line is really, really good. He has 43 base attack, and if I remember correctly, he has a super boot in it, so he's going to be hitting absurdly hard in general. 26 speed, not the highest, but he can still make a guaranteed follow-up attack and has access to the likes of flow, so he can secure his doubles more often than not. 39-30 defense res, which is really good for taking hits in general, and because of the amount of debuffs he's inflicting on the foe, it does get inflated quite a bit. If you want to use him on budget, you could pretty much just keep his base kit, so you can make him like a mixed hybrid of like support and combat. You can run attack defense catch with double distant guard, give him a special, and run attack defense link. Definitely works out there. It's not bad whatsoever, especially since both can benefit from the skills, minus distant guard because he can't use it on himself. But if you want to max invest into him, then I highly recommend just upgrading his catch to tier 4, giving him a flow skill. Flow refresh is probably the best option so he can heal and maintain his HP condition. Attack smoke 4 so he can prevent a lot of doubles, especially from units with guaranteed follow-ups. And heavy blade, which he'll easily make the check because his attack is so goddamn high. So he can trigger 3 cooldown specials really, really consistently. And honestly, if it weren't for Finn, I would argue that Geralt is probably the best accessible landscape that we have in the game. Just because he has so much going for him, both supportively and combatively. And in my opinion, if you don't want to build Finn, Geralt is definitely a good substitute. Even though they do different things, Geralt definitely has a lot more survivability because he has better mixed bulk, but Finn definitely has better damage output because of his ability to double regardless of the foe's speed because of his dual phase brave. Next we have New Year Leg Yarn, who has a chill defense weapon. In terms of stat line, she's pretty generic as well. She's pretty akin to the likes of Ferdinand, with 32-35 attack speed, a bit higher defense at 35, and lower res at 17. They're pretty much going to be doing the same thing for the most part, so in terms of just overall differences, there really aren't that many. If you want to use her on budget, you can pretty much just make her a chill bot with some sort of supportive niche. You can give her 3 chills with chill attack seal. I'm pretty sure she comes with chill res already, so that's perfectly fine. And then you can keep her innate Wagasa, give her steady posture too, so if you need her to take a hit in the enemy phase, she can, and keep her defense tactics, so she, at the very least, she can still provide a good amount of support. However, if you want to use her on premium, you can pretty much just do the same thing as like all the other speedy cavs, stack up her attack and speed as much as possible, give her a flow, speed smoke 4, and a catch, or anything that boosts her attack and speed from the Sacred Seal, so that way she can secure doubles and tank quite a bit. And again, for the most part, she's pretty akin to the likes of Ferdinand and all the other generic Lance cavs who don't really have a defined PRF or niche, which is why, for the most part, they're pretty much going to have the same rating, 5.5 out of 10. She is cheaper to build, but that's mainly for the supportive side of it. If you just want to use her for combat, it's definitely going to take a lot more resources. Next, we have Spring Luthier, who has Carrot Tip Spear, which boosts his attack by a good amount of stats, depending on how many penalties are on the foe based on their attack and defense. He also gets an attack defense bonus if he meets the HP check, which is still really nice. In terms of his stat line, it's definitely a lot more modern. He is one of the newer additions, so it makes sense. He has 38 base attack and 36 speed, which is pretty decent. 31 defense and 27 res, which is okay for mixed bulk, I guess. But in terms of just general tanking, it's better to have more defense than res, especially since more often than not, foes are going to be targeting his defense, especially at 1 range. But nevertheless, if you just want to use him on budget, you could keep his innate Carrot Tip Spear, run double smoke, defense smoke, and attack smoke, so that way he's getting a good amount of damage on every first hit. And then Fury Desperation, which at least allows him to consistently double before the foe can counterattack, which isn't the worst, especially if you're just looking to use him right out of the gate. However, if you want to use him on premium, you could give him Ninja Naginata with a bunch of attack and speed, so that way he could just double really consistently, and at the very least, this will at least allow him to perform quite adequately in the player phase. Sure, you're going to be going up against some units that will probably give him a harder time if they have really good defense, but even then, 2 attacks with true damage and then a bunch of attack and speed, he'll more than likely quad a lot of the time, and then he could always just run away with near trace, so it's not the worst. But again, fairly generic, especially comparatively to the likes of New Year Leg Yarn, Ferdinand, you name it. He's basically going to get the same rating as a result. Next, we have Matilda, who's kind of a sleeper hit. She isn't exactly the craziest unit, but for what it's worth, she actually does fare quite well, all things considered. She has a slang weapon and then the same refine as Cleve, Spectrum 3 to herself, and supported ally during combat if within 2 spaces of that unit. In terms of her general stat line, offensively, it's arguable depending on like whether or not it's worse. She does have speed, which is nice, but 29 base attack is pretty low. She does have a lot of res at 34, which is okay. And then you also have 35 HP and 24 defense, so if she does go up against a melee foe, there's a good chance that she could always get 1 shot or 2 tap, depending on how many attacks she has to take. But nevertheless, there is a good amount of potential with her. If you just want to use her on budget, I highly recommend just making her a support unit. Give her Fortress Res, Sabotage Attack, and then Double Drive Attack, so that way she can act quite supportably. That's definitely one of the boons with having a good rest stat, is that you can just use sabotages, which is really, really nice. However, if you want to use her on premium, you can actually make her a Gale Force unit, which is really, really nice. Because she has sling and access to the likes of flows and trace, she can actually Gale Force after her first combat, as long as there aren't any guard effects. Don't count on like Heavy Blade or whatever, but you don't even need it, especially if you're running Quicken Pulse. You could always substitute Quicken Pulse for anything that grants accelerated cooldown from maybe a Grim Raphael or Valoria, or Grand Scratcher, but Grand Scratcher is really not going to be reliable, especially on a unit with 56 attack at max investment. But nevertheless, you can stack up her attack and speed, have her initiate, and then run away, and then still act supportively, because Knightly Lance does provide joint drive spectrum stats, which is really nice. And while I did say Cleve was a 5 out of 10, I think because Matilda has a better offensive stat line, even though her attack is definitely way lower, she does have slang, which means it's more easy to trigger Gale Force. And for that reason, I do think she could act a lot better, both as a supportive unit and a combat unit, mainly because she's not tied to the enemy phase. And honestly, I think if it weren't for the slang, I'd probably put her a bit lower, because slang, while not necessarily the most important, does help out a lot, especially since she does have a good speed set, meaning that you can stack it and have her function in the player phase if needed. So she can still act as a Gale Force support unit, which is really nice in my opinion. Next, we have Orson, who is a really okay unit. He does suffer similarly to the likes of Berkut, Conrad, Fernand. He does have a bit more speed, which you can still stack up if you want to use him in the player phase, which isn't the worst per se. But in terms of his PRF, it's kind of mediocre. He does get a bunch of attack and defense based on how far away he is from allies, which is okay. But then he also gets the dull effect, meaning that you can't stack visible buffs against him, which is nice. However, the problem mainly comes from the fact that if you are going to use him as an enemy phase unit, then you're absolutely going to have to ditch this PRF because you're more than likely never going to get any of these effects going. And if you could get even one of them going, then there's a good chance that it's still going to be performing a lot worse than any other inheritable. In terms of his overall stat line, he has 38 attack, which is really good, 36 defense, which is nice, 28 speed, which you can make workable, and then 23 res is going to be his dump stat. In terms of budget, you can pretty much just make him an enemy phase cav, but I would highly recommend just separating him from as many allies as possible, even if it means he has to be all alone without getting any sort of support, unless it's from maybe like visible buffs or like sparking boost plus or whatever the case may be. Basically stack up his attack and defense as much as possible and then give him quick riposte, so that way he could just act as a really good melee tank. And if you were to use him on premium, you could still try to speed stack him. I think there's merit to it because his speed isn't exactly the lowest, and his attack is pretty good, so you can actually secure heavy blade checks quite consistently. And in my opinion, if you are going to do that, you basically just want to stack up as much attack and speed as possible, and still do the same thing as his budget kit, just keep him away from allies as much as possible. And for what it's worth, I do think there is more potential with him than there is with Conrad and Berkut, and that's why I'm giving him a 0.5 above. But in terms of overall prowess, I do think he could be a bit better, and I'm hopeful that whenever he gets a refund, which is probably not going to be for a long time, they can at least remove this really bad effect of just having to be away from like a bunch of allies within 3 spaces, because that's really, really strict in terms of just getting support. Next we have Oscar, who isn't actually that bad offensively. He has a sling weapon that grants attack speed 3 to himself and infantry and cavalry allies within 2 spaces. It's basically a joint drive attack at speed if he can meet the condition. Supportively, it's pretty strict, but for what it's worth, it's still an attack speed boost, so it's not really the worst. Offensively, he also has 33-34 attack speed, which isn't that bad. His mixed build could definitely be a bit better, but comparatively to the likes of maybe Abel, they're pretty similar. Abel does have a bit less attack and speed, but their defenses are also pretty similar. And for the most part, I would say they're like pretty much the same unit. You could always ditch his PRF if you want to, but for what it's worth, it's not exactly the worst per se, especially if you just want to make him a support unit, which is what I'm doing here. In terms of support, you could pretty much just give him Snag, which isn't exactly like the greatest support skill, but in terms of just budget B slots for support, there really aren't that many, especially for cavalry units, which is why I put it here. Attack speed bond with 4, meaning that he could just stack up attack and speed as much as possible. And then with noontime, he could always heal back on every first hit, meaning that his sustainability can be pretty decent. And then for his premium set, I'm still going down the supportive route. Even though it's not necessarily the greatest, it still works for what it is, because it's still attack speed bonus. In terms of just support, you could always just go Allied Lance, because even though it doesn't grant speed, it grants defense, and it works on every ally. The idea here is basically just to turn him into a Bright Shrine Soaker, so you give him life in death 4 with HP attack 2, so that way he could also provide even pulse tie support. And yeah, it's pretty akin to other support cavalry units. You give him a rally plus, and he does work. However, in terms of support, I don't find him to be like the craziest. It can still work. And in terms of just his offensive capabilities, he's not really much better than Abel, which is why I do think a 5.5 out of 10 is more than fair for Oscar. Next, we have Perry, who has a Slang Sealed Falchion. Now, I say Sealed Falchion because when Perry got a refund, this was basically Sealed Falchion before Sealed Falchion's refund, except it didn't have +5, it basically granted Slang instead, and it had +4. And for what it was worth, it wasn't even that bad of a weapon at the time. Offensively, she has 33 attack speed, which is pretty decent, 23 defense, which is a bit low, and 30 res, which whatever. Outside of her offenses, her bulk is just really low in general, which may not matter too much if you are just making her into a player phase menace, because she does need to be below 100% HP in general just for her weapon to work, which is why her bulk isn't really like the biggest forefront here. If you just want to use her on budget, you could stack up Fury, give her Desperation and Defense Smoke, so that way she can trigger Moonball on every second hit, and can double consistently, provided that she makes the speed check. She will want Fury somewhere in her kit, so that way she could at least always maintain her PRF effect. And for what it's worth, again, it's still not a bad weapon, although we do have better inheritables, but it still works, all things considered. Especially on premium, you could give her Iceberg with Surge Sparrow and Flow Guard, so that way she could continuously secure her own doubles, and then also with Flow Guard, she can prevent incoming specials from enemy retaliations, which is really nice. But again, similarly to the likes of Abel, she still shares a fairly similar stat line, which is why a 5.5 is going to be the score I give her, just because, again, they're fairly similar offensively. Even if they have their own PRFs, I don't find that their matchups are generally going to be all too different. Next, we have Petrine, who is pretty decent. She has beast effectiveness, which, I mean, is okay. I guess it's a bit niche, but can still work when you need it. She also targets the foe's res if her HP is above 50% and inflicts -5 speed and res during combat. So she's going to be hitting way harder than a lot of other Lance Cavalry will, because most melee foes don't have a good res stat. They generally prioritize their defense because those tend to be the most common. So this is actually a good niche for her to have. On top of the fact that she has 35-37 attack speed, she can actually hit quite hard in general. If you want to use her on budget, I highly recommend just trying for one-shots. You can try and stack up her attack and speed as much as possible, so if she needs to double, she can. But with Chill Res, Auto Attack Wave, Blade Session, and Swift Sparrow 2, there's a good chance that she could still one-shot if their res is pretty low, and most melee foes don't have a lot of res as is, so this can still work on budget. However, if you want to use her on premium, you could go the Surge Sparrow route with lull speed res and speed smoke 4, so that way she can also reduce the amount of damage she takes, but also maintain her 50% HP condition and output a good amount of damage in general. And in my opinion, she's definitely one of the more sleeper hits in terms of just Lance Cavalry. We do have Finn and Geralt now, so it makes sense why you don't really want to use her per se, but for what it's worth, she's still a really decent investment, which is why if you did want to build her, I could absolutely recommend it. Next we have Roadie, who has a Fire Sweep Lance that has Darting Blow built into it. The pinnacle of Gen 1 refines. Really basic. He has 31-34 attack speed, which is okay offensively. Defensively, he has pretty much the same bulk as Abel, and you can pretty much see where I'm going with this. You can keep his PRF and then make him a hit and run unit with the likes of Double Fury, hit and run, defense smoke. So if you run Dancer support, you could just repo him out, and that could always work. That's not the worst per se, especially on budget, but even then, Double Fury can at least make him a Wings of Mercy beacon if he could set it up. And in terms of his premium set, you're basically doing the same thing as a lot of the other Lance Cavs. You're stacking up as much attack and speed as possible, and you can upgrade his hit and run to near trace so he can run away a lot more. And then with Speed Smoke 4, if he has to take a hit in the enemy phase, then he can. And his weapon doesn't have an HP condition, so it's not the worst by any means. But again, similarly to the likes of Ferdinand and all the other Cavs with a similar stat line, he's going to be ranking 5.5 out of 10 because they all pretty much perform the same. Next we have Roshea, who is another generic Lance unit, but he's a bit more modern. He has 38-35 attack speed, which is pretty good. He has 38 defense, which is also really good. Res is definitely going to be his dump stat at 21 base, but he comes with Stout Lance for some reason, which is really weird considering he does have a good speed stat. So you do want to replace that pretty much immediately because it's never really going to work outside of the stat boost, or if the foe has a guaranteed follow-up, but that's really dependent on the foe, which is why I highly recommend just swapping out for something like Unbound Lance. In terms of just budget though, it's really difficult for Lance Cavs in general just to do anything budget, which is why this set does kind of look a bit finicky. I give him Rouse Speed Defense, so at least it can synergize with Unbound Lance since it does have to be solo. And then I also give him Attack Defense Catch and Attack Speed solo so he can stack up his 3 best stats. Not the worst by any means. For his premium set, however, he does have a lot more to work with. Because his defense and speed are pretty good, and he also has good attack, you can actually run him with Piercing Tribute and an attack speed unity, so he can actually act as a competent enemy phase cav. Albeit, again, he still suffers from a lot of similar issues as other enemy phase cavs, but because he has access to Piercing Tribute, it's going to be less noticeable. But still, outside of just trying to do something unique with another generic Lance cav, he's pretty much going to be performing akin to the likes of all the other ones, but he is modern, so he's going to take a lot less investment, which is really nice. Next we have Sylas, who gets a lot, and I mean a lot of attack and defense from his weapon, and that's pretty much the notable part about his weapon. He does have armor effectiveness, which is nice, and he does prevent follow-ups, but given that his speed stat is not exactly the highest, it's not really going to be doing too much, especially since he's an enemy phase cav. He's still relying on quick riposte for any sort of double, which kind of sucks. In terms of his stat line, he has a good amount of attack and defense, but his res is absolutely going to be his dump stat, and his HP is pretty decent for what it's worth. If you want to use him on budget, you can pretty much keep his base kit, but you can also run odd defense wave and quick riposte, so that way he can at the very least double in the enemy phase when needed to, but he's still prone to the likes of no follow-up effects and impacts and so on and so forth. And in terms of his premium, you're basically just going down the upgrade route where you're basically maintaining the same stuff, but rather than running like Stance 3, You can run attack defense unity, joint drive attack, and then you can also give him heavy blade because there's a good chance he'll be able to secure heavy blade checks because he gets a lot of attack from his weapon. So this can still be nice for what it's worth. However, akin to the likes of Berkut, Conrad, Fernand, he still suffers greatly as a result of his enemy phase status, and given that his speed isn't exactly the highest, I don't really think he's going to be performing much better than the other two, especially since his res isn't exactly as high either. Because at the very least, Berkut does get 8 res from his weapon, so there's some merit there, but any notable enemy is more than likely going to be able to prevent any sort of follow-up prevention or has a null follow-up effect or whatever the case may be, which is why I do think a 5 out of 10 is more than suitable for Sylas. And then last but not least, we have Sully, who honestly kinda got the short end of the stick. I'll be fair though, in terms of her refine effect, it's really, really good. Enemy phase Brave is still a really coveted effect. Even if it's not dual phase, you're still attacking twice no matter what in the enemy phase, and it's a lot more lenient than Abel's because you can still position yourself in a way where you just have to sit there, you don't have to initiate combat. That's really, really good. The problem, in my opinion, really stems from the base effect, which is just Triangle Adept, as that just neuters so many of her matchups. And to be fair, her attack isn't really good. 26 base is really low, but this doesn't really help her case either. And even though she could still take out red units, because wow, blue beats red, it's really doing more harm than good in my opinion. In terms of her overall stat line, it's definitely all over the place. 26 attack is really low. Defensively, it's not really that high. 34 speed is pretty good, and 42 HP is not bad whatsoever. If you just want to use her on budget, basically just make her an enemy phase Cav. She definitely fares better than a lot of other enemy phase Cavs because of the enemy phase Brave, but because of the Triangle Adept built into it, it's definitely going to make it a lot harder for her to take out other foes, especially since her attack set is really low. Just give her Kestrel Stance 2, Speed Smoke, and Attack Speed Form, so that way she could stack up her attack and speed as much as possible. And you could also keep her innate Swordbreaker, so that way she could just secure kills against red units, which isn't the worst by any means, but again, the Triangle Adept really does hold her back, which is why for a premium set, I do think giving her Cancel Affinity is probably the way to go. You can still stack up her attack and speed with the likes of Kestrel Stance 3, Joint Drive Attack, and Attack Speed Form, so that way she could secure doubles or potentially even quad in the enemy phase, which is still nice for what it's worth. But the fact of the matter is that the Triangle Adept just makes it so much more difficult for her to perform. And even though there aren't really any notable enemy phase Cav skills, especially for the B slot, having to give up her B slot for Cancel Affinity does weaken her matchups in a considerable manner, especially when you consider the fact that her base attack is really low as is, and her weapon doesn't grant her any stats. So that B slot could have just gone towards boosting her stats in general. And even though she does have a really nice enemy phase niche, I still think she's just a bit worse than the likes of Berkut, Conrad, and so on and so forth because of the fact that her attack is just really, really low. Her mixed bulk isn't really that great as is. Even though enemy phase Brave is really good, she still has to give up her B slot for Cancel Affinity, which is why I don't think she's as good as the likes of Berkut, Conrad, and Fernand because they have just more natural bulk. Even though they'll more than likely get doubled anyway, they're more likely to take hits because they have better mixed bulk, which is why I do think out of all the Lance Cavs in the game, Sully's probably the worst one. However, I'm hopeful that if we were to get something like a Cancel Affinity seal in the future, then I could see Sully being a lot better. But until that point, I'm not really sold on her performance. And that's about it for all the Lance Cavs. There are so many Lance Cavs that are readily available. However, if you had to pick any, Finn, Geralt, Petrine, those are like 3 of the best options you could go for in my opinion. And guess what? They all cost grails, so have fun saving. Anyway, this has been my readily available Lance Cav tier list analysis thingy-majiggy, whatever the case may be, whatever you want to call it. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.